There. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for a kind of breakout session this morning. I thought we'd do it a little bit differently in that for those of you who were here yesterday, you heard me talk a lot. So I'm going to hopefully kind of lead us through a kind of guided set of thoughts together. And I'm going to save a little discussion time at the very end. But I know that one of the things that I find when I'm listening to people is that it often, I've kind of got two tracks going in my brain. I've got like what I'm hearing from them, and I've got what it means to me kind of over here on this side of my head. If you've got anything to write with I'd encourage you to get it out, because I may just ask you, or you can make some mental notes. Because I think one of the things I'm going to ask is, as we're going, just to kind of be aware of like what's coming to mind, and maybe just make some notes for yourself. You can do it on your phone, on your iPad, whatever works. And then maybe we can bring some of those threads together at the very end to kind of hear kind of what comes forth. So the topic for today is kind of where do we go from here? So I'm going to try to think about pragmatic things that we might begin to do. This is a little predominantly white space here, and so I think most of what I've got to say applies to white people and sitting in white spaces. And so if we kind of be thinking about that, and that's the journey kind of I've been on, and going to invite you to go a little bit with me. But I want to start with really my own journey, and the first thing I think that I think all of us, we who are white, have to kind of get over is some resistance to kind of going down this path. And that I think there's a number of reasons for that. I'm going to read a little, as we go, I'm going to kind of read a couple of passages from the book that helps I kind of cue this up here. But I think the first one is just a sense of being overwhelmed. All right, that if we really take the history seriously and we start to take this in, it just feels so big, right? And it is really big. And so there's almost this sense of like, I don't know where to start. And I don't, if I did take one step, I'm not sure what the next one would be. So I want to just give a little passage here. I spent some time, and some of you may know the folks with Scott Dickinson and the good folks at the First Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia. And that is a church that's closely connected to my own family's story. The First Baptist Church started a church in East Macon, which was the kind of working class side of town, which is where my parents grew up. They were married in that church, grew up in that church, but it was a church plant, essentially, by First Baptist Macon. So in some ways, it's kind of back up the line, a kind of parent church to me in many ways. And they've kind of been on this journey of trying to engage the African-American congregation that actually used to be part of their church as enslaved people prior to the Civil War. And that formed its own church and was literally sitting around the corner. Like you could see both steeples at one time when you're standing on the hill in Macon, and you could throw a golf ball from one parking lot to the other, right? So it's that close. And yet for 150 years, they had been completely separate, really not done hardly anything together. And when they first began to come together, there was this kind of interesting interaction, and a white member just confessed that she was completely overwhelmed and didn't know what to do, and kind of said that out loud in a meeting like this. And there was just kind of this silence, and then it was a mixed meeting of both churches, and one of the older African American women in the congregation just kind of put her hand on her shoulder and said, "Of course you are." Right, and that just kind of sat there in the meeting for a while as a kind of honest recognition, and I thought there was something really powerful about that, right? Of just kind of giving permission for this white woman to say, like, I'm overwhelmed. I really don't know what to do with this information I've given, and a kind of acknowledgement that it's big. If we take this seriously, it really is. A big deal. I thought there was a kind of a moment of compassion, but also a moment of accountability, right? Not letting her off the hook. There wasn't it's not so bad, or kind of, stroking her arm and saying, we can just move on, but kind of just letting that kind of weight sit out there for us, and giving kind of permission to feel overwhelmed. And also the sense that kind of discomfort isn't an excuse to stop, right? That it's something that we have to sit with. I studied Buddhism a little bit during grad school, and there's this concept of entering the stream when one sort of begins into a practice. And I think that's where many of us are, right? With this very beginning, we're dipping our toe into this stream. It's a little scary, it's a little cold, not quite sure, and there's a kind of tentativeness about it, and even a discomfort and a fear about it. And I think one thing is I just want to name it and just say that's okay, right? I mean, it's certainly something I've had to kind of wrestle with in my own life. And let me just name a couple of other things, and if you're writing or thinking, maybe you could sort of try to get in touch with a little bit of those feelings as well. I'm just going to read a few that were kind of, I think I mentioned I spent some time journaling before I began working on the book, and that was partly about just kind of bringing my own awareness up a little bit. But here are some things out of my own kind of, this feeling of being overwhelmed, not knowing where to start. Another one, being afraid it would unravel everything. If I pull this thread, what else comes with it, right? Is it just a seam? Does the whole sleeve of the sweater fall off? Does the whole sweater unravel? Like, where does it lead? A kind of fear of not knowing the end game. Maybe it's stuff I don't want to know. Do I really want to know? I think I shared in the thing last night. Did I really want to know that my grandfather, as a deacon in East Macon Baptist Church, that his job was to stand on the steps and make sure no black people entered the sanctuary? Like, is that something I really wanted to know about my family, about my grandfather? Did I really want to know that in 1815, my sixth great grandfather enslaved 6 people in Middle Georgia, and that the only artifact I have, his name was Pleasant Moon, of all things, but the only thing I have from him is a Bible from 1815. Right? That's the family artifact I have, is a Bible from this person who enslaves 6 other people, and I have the will that names them by name, attaches a monetary value to that person, and to find out that they weren't really that wealthy, but that those 6 enslaved people comprised 70% of their earthly possessions when they cataloged him when he died. It was cataloged along 1 cow, 1 bed, 1 cart, and this was how, even at a subsistence farm of 200 acres, not a gone with the wind situation at all, but how that worked. But, what does that mean? What do I do with that information when I have it? And then the last one are 2 quotes, I think, that came out of my time with the First Baptist Church in Macon, that one of the members of the church's historian said that one of the things that he realized was a myth that had to kind of die, right, or at least had to have another story brought alongside it, was this idea, I think, that many of us, especially who are heavily invested in church, have of our institutions being places where good people do good things. Like, that's who we are. Right? We're good people who do good things. And we can point to, like, charities and, like, all kinds of stuff, food kitchens, clothing closets, like all kinds of good things that we've done. That is all true. And I can certainly say the church that I grew up in, I wouldn't be sitting here with you today. I wouldn't be who I am today were it not for all the good things that church gave to me growing up, and the support it provided for me, all of that. And it was also the place that gave me a theology that made it very difficult for me to see social injustice. Like, that's all true at the same time. And so kind of wrestling with that. And then the last one I'll give is actually from a church member that said that his hope and his fear were the same thing. It was such an eloquent statement. This is a white, fairly well-known member, holds kind of a public office in Bibb County, and who reluctantly signed up for a trip for them to go to see the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery on a trip that they were going to go on together. And he signed up at the last minute, and he said, look, I was really wrestling with this. And when they were doing the pre-trip thing, they asked, well, what are your hopes? What are your fears? And this was, again, a mixed group from both predominantly white and black churches here. And he said in that meeting, he said, well, look, I did sign up late. I almost didn't come. And I think I'm realizing that my hope and my fear are actually the same thing. And that is that I will feel responsible. Right? That's my hope and my fear, that I will feel responsible. Like knowing that he kind of needed to get there and worried about what the implications were if he did. So I just kind of want to just start with naming that space. And if there's any of those kinds of things swirling around that kind of, I think make us flinch, make us look away. I often think about this as an exercise of looking intently in a mirror, right? And one of the reasons why I read a lot of James Baldwin work on this book is because I felt like Baldwin, and for those of you who are white and don't know James Baldwin's work, let me just say, like, he has probably shaped my current theology more than any white theologian that I've ever read. He is a black gay man from Harlem, right? Who grew up in the African American church in Harlem and died in the 80s. But I found his words to be like really prophetic for our current moment. I just find myself coming back. I mean, I titled the book after a passage from him. "White too long" is actually a phrase that comes from him. But I think just kind of sitting with this, and so part of what I think Baldwin has done for me is to kind of hold a gaze. I think what white churches have never been that good at doing is seeing ourselves through the eyes of others, right? We are very good about telling stories about ourselves. But I think one of the things to get clear about is like, what does it look like if we see our church history through the eyes of the African American members of our community, for example? What would that look like? What would that story? Would it just be indifference? Would it be obstacles? What would it look like? So if that's the kind of opener there, I thought I'd also read a little. I'm going to read like 4 passages because what I did at the end of the book is I tried to come to a place of telling a truer story about my own narrative, right? And again, this kind of "and" piece to the story, and doesn't have to obliterate the other parts of the story, but the "and" piece of the story. And I'm gonna read it, but as I read it, what I'd like you to do is kind of do that kind of 2 split screen thing in your head, and like think, all right, well, what does this conjure for me? What does this bring up for me as I'm telling kind of this piece about how would I tell a truer story about my family, a truer story about my journey? I'm going to start with this Bible piece here, but use this as an exercise for yourself as well as you're kind of hearing kind of my piece of it. On the top shelf in my house is a family Bible that belonged to my 5th great-grandfather on my mother's side. Printed in 1815, it's inscribed on the front inside cover with the following words. Presented by Nathaniel Ellis to his friend Pleasant Moon, July 17, 1825. Pleasant Moon was among the first generation of my mother's family to be born in Georgia, where 5 generations of my family have lived in either Twiggs County or Bibb County, the adjacent county on the north that is the home of Macon. Both my parents grew up in East Macon. Our family was one of the few that moved away. I have warm memories of visiting a host of aunts, uncles, cousins on both sides during our yearly pilgrimage back home. Pleasant's father, William H. Moon, my 6th great-grandfather, had been born in 1740 in Albemarle County, Virginia, and served in the Revolutionary Army. Sometime after 1790, he moved his family to the Georgia frontier on land that was being seized by the Georgia government from the indigenous inhabitants of the land, the Creek and Cherokee Indians, and distributed via rolling land lotteries to white settlers. Although I have not been able to locate the will for my 5th great-grandfather, I have been able to locate the one for his father, Pleasant Moon Sr., he's the one who made the journey from Virginia to Georgia with the extended family at the close of the 18th century. His will is an illuminating window into the role slavery played in my family's modest fortunes, and more generally its role among what we think of today as white lower middle class families. While they had the means to relocate from Virginia, my Georgia Baptist ancestors weren't wealthy planter class of Gone with the Wind. Typical land lots were 200 acres, nowhere near the size of major cotton plantations in the area. His death in 1818, the county recorded his will and an inventory of the goods and chattels of Pleasant Moon deceased. The inventory was thorough, including items like 1 young bay mare at $60, and one bay horse cart at $35, one cow at $15, 7 head of sheep at $11, one feather bed and furniture at $90, one shotgun at $11. Not counting the land, my 6 great-grandfather's estate was fairly modest, totaling $2,293.22, or approximately $46,000 in today's dollars. Most surprising, though, were 2 listings near the top. One Negro woman named Naomi at $800, one named Susan at $450, totaling $1,250. And on the line below that, one named Eliza at $275 and one named Bird, a boy, at $150, totaling $425. To put this in perspective, there's no other single line in the page-long household inventory that registers more than $100. Taken together, these 2 lines of human enslaved property totaled $1,675, accounting for an astonishing 73% of the assets of the state. In other words, even among my barely above subsistence farming ancestors, their way of life and economic well-being were thoroughly dependent on owning slaves. On September 20th, and I'm jumping forward to 1920, Isom Andrews, my great-grandfather and husband of Pleasant Moon's great-granddaughter, was killed. He was supervising the pulling of a post at St. John and Sons Clay Mines near Dry Branch, Georgia, when a steel cable snapped and struck him, breaking his arm and crushing his skull. The event sent shockwaves through my mother's side of the family, leaving my great-grandmother Beulah with little money and 4 small children. It was ultimately too much for her. She eventually left the 4 kids to fend for themselves, leaving the 2 older ones who were in their early teens to care for the 2 younger ones, while she pursued 2 subsequent husbands and started another family with one of them. The family disarray righted itself only 2 generations later with my mother, Beulah's granddaughter, through her second marriage, who was adopted and raised in a stable household by Beulah's daughter from the first marriage and her husband, right? So kind of Southern families, you know it. So I grew up vaguely knowing this story of the tragic premature death of my great-grandfather at the age of 36. But when in high school, my great-uncle, who was Isom's son, told me a more sinister side of the story that reflected the racial dynamics of the time. Although the Atlanta Constitution reported that my great-grandfather's death was an accident, and no evidence was ever publicly presented otherwise, according to my great-uncle, Isom's co-workers blamed his death on an African-American working that day. The next week, as my great-uncle told the story, the black man they singled out was accidentally crushed by a heavy cart of clay at the mine. And I accidentally in quotes. I know what havoc my great-grandfather's death wreaked in my mother's family, but I have no way of knowing what demons this retributive white racial violence unleashed on that African-American man's family. I certainly know he was a black man living in Jim Crow era Georgia in the 1920s, one of the most brutal periods of white racial terrorism in the country. And I know that my white great-grandfather was a supervisor while the African-American man was a line worker, most likely living near poverty in a high segregated society with few resources. He probably lived with some sense of vulnerability and the fragility of life on a daily basis. Given the dangers of clay mining, I'm sure he worried that a mistake with heavy machinery could lead to serious injury or death. And given the ferocity of white supremacy in the 1920s, I can only assume that both he and his family wondered as he left for work each day whether a misstep with his white coworkers or the wrong encounter on the road might be more perilous than the mine. When my great-uncle first told me the story, I simply accepted it. I don't remember asking any questions, but I was puzzled by the significance of it and why he would take pains to pass it along to me. Over the years, it has stayed with me. As I reflect on it now, the word that comes to me to describe my great-uncle's disposition as he told the story is satisfaction. While he never spelled out its full meaning, the story seemed to convey a reassurance about our place in the social pecking order, that even if accidental, the death of a white man would demand retribution. When a white man was killed, in other words, the universe lurched sideways. Retaliatory racial violence promised to balance the scales, reinscribing white dominance, particularly through its arbitrariness. And just one more quick piece. And what I invite you on this piece to kind of think about the places that you've lived and what you know about the history of racial violence and discrimination. This was striking to me as I kind of wrote this up. With the exception of a few preschool years, I lived in Wichita Falls, Texas. I have never lived in a county that is free from a history of lynching. In reverse chronological order, here are the counties in which I've lived, the number of documented cases of white racial terrorism. Montgomery County, Maryland, which is one of the bluest, most liberal counties in the country, 2. Greene County, Missouri, 4. DeKalb County, Georgia, 4. Tarrant County, Texas, 1. Hinds County, Mississippi, where I mostly grew up, 22. Behar County, Texas, 6. The places where I spent the most formative years in Hinds County, 22 lynchings, it's the county with the fourth highest number of lynchings in Mississippi and is tied for 15th place as the county with the most lynchings nationwide. At the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery that I mentioned, the engravers had to use a smaller font to fit all the names and the dates on the 6-foot steel memorial for the county. Even this awful tally understates the case. My home state, which lauds itself as the hospitality state, contains such a density of counties with legacies of lynchings that they drive up the total to 654, giving Mississippi the dishonor of having the highest number of recorded lynchings in any state. And I've told other stories that you've heard before, but about my experiencing the first African-American kids coming to my public school, my high school being the rebels. But all of this was, I think, fairly oblivious to me before I really started doing this work 5 to 6 years ago. And so I just kind of inviting you to kind of take that in again and kind of think about, like, what does that mean? And what would that mean for me to do, this kind of work here? I guess the last thing I want to do is kind of go through a little thing, something that's a work in progress. I'm going to kind of share it with you, something to think about. And then we'll have a little bit of time to kind of, I just want to hear back from you, kind of what this has all brought to mind. But one of the things I've been recommending to folks is they think and do, to individuals, to do a kind of journaling exercise. It's kind of an individual audit, but also for churches and institutions to do a more institutional audit. So I'm going to kind of just throw out some ideas that I've been kind of percolating about what this might look like for your own churches, congregations, institutions, to think about places to start. Like, where can we start? I've said on a number of occasions that I think if every white church in America would tell the story, an honest story about why it geographically sits where it does, this would so very quickly get to the issue of race. Any church that's been there for any time is likely in an area that was a whites-only area of the city. We certainly can't look at any city map today and still see the signs of redlining and racial discrimination there. If it's out in the suburbs, it's newer. Well, why that suburb? Like my own home church, Woodville Heights Baptist Church, was in a white working class suburb of Jackson, Mississippi. It got annexed into the city and then became a more mixed neighborhood. And as soon as that happened, this was like in the 80s, whites moved out to the north side of town up to Madison and essentially replanted the church, like abandoned the church, abandoned the neighborhood, and reformed the church up in the whites area of Madison, Mississippi. And so today, I can still go back and see many of the people I grew up with in a church all together, but up in Madison County, up north of Jackson. And the neighborhood where I grew up is almost entirely African American. Now, the church is now a National Baptist African American church, that's there. So, what's the history, there? Why is it where it is? Other things to think about. Stained glass windows, if your church has those. If it's older, it may have them. This church has them. What are the images? What are the skin tones? If there's a picture of Jesus, is he white? And does that matter? I'd suggest that it does matter. And what do we do with all the white Jesuses that are either out there or hanging on the walls? There's a famous kind of Aryan Jesus painting that is one of the most reproduced images of any kind in the world. It's been reproduced billions and billions of times. Salman, I think, is the name of the artist. It was handed out to soldiers heading out to World War II, and it's still hanging on many white Christian churches today. But I would suggest that one of the things we've got to do is deal with white Jesus in our churches. What about nativity scenes? Baby Jesus, always white in white churches, right? Mary and Joseph, white. Wise men, maybe brown, right? What's that about? And what should we do about that? Children's Sunday school materials are some of the worst culprits. There's children's Bibles. Jesus is white, Moses is white. They're all white, right? Daniel in the lion's den, like all those kind of pictorial things. And what is that saying to the next generation pre-verbal, right? Before they can even read. What's hanging up on the walls in the churches? If you did an audit of your church, how many brown bodies would there be on the walls of the church going around. All these things kind of make a difference. Who's using the building? Are there any non-white people using the building? And why not? What does the website look like? Those virtual images on the website. What message is that sending about who the body of Christ is? Kind of looking for what's there, looking for what's not. But I think being aware, bringing these things to awareness. I mentioned kind of telling the history of the church building and location. Most churches who've been around for a while, somebody has at some point gone and written a church history. It usually tells some rosy picture about the founders and who they are, and all the great things they did to found the church. But what else did they do? In the city. What do they do in terms of things like restricted neighborhood covenants? What did they do in the civil rights era if they were around for those periods? Were they members of the Klan? I mean, you'd be surprised. And so are supportive of those institutions. And I think if it's an older historic church, was it built by enslaved people? Did it used to have a mixed congregation as white people brought enslaved people to church with them? And what happened in that story? But I think this kind of, where did the church stand up? Where did it not? Right, on issues. It's easier to kind of do it in the past, but where's it standing up today on voting rights, mass incarceration, the Black Lives Matter movement? Those things, like what's going on? Are those conversations happening or not? If not, why not? Hymns. Take a look at the hymnal. There was a passage last night in Psalm 51 that gets translated, "Wash me and I will be whiter than snow." And I don't know how many of you kind of either tripped over or kind of paused there for that piece. But I mean, there's a whole hymn, right? We used to sing growing up, like, "Wash me and I will be whiter than snow, yes, whiter than snow. Wash me and I will be whiter than snow." What work is that doing? Like, we really should think about these things. A little audit. And what are we singing? Are we singing many hymns that didn't come just out of a kind of white church tradition? And the ones that do, what kind of symbolism are they using for white and black, light and dark? And how might we think about that? There was this is from the Catholic Church, but Father Brian Massengale gave a sermon, or not a sermon, did a study about sermons in Catholic dioceses and parishes, and he found that despite the fact that the Bishops' Conference had given instructions to do kind of racial justice awareness Sundays and emphases, when they actually did a survey of parishioners, they found that through the entire preaching of the lectionary, that is, through a 3-year movement of the entire text of the Bible, that the overwhelming number of Catholics reported not hearing one thing, nothing, on racial justice. So that means that priests preaching through the entire Bible found not one opportunity to do a sermon that explicitly talked about racial justice. Where's that happening? Where's it not happening? In our churches. Membership and leadership. This is something I think really. I think a lot of churches talk about wanting to be multiracial. Churches want to be more inviting spaces. That will never happen if the leadership is not multiracial. So kind of thinking hard about that. If that's a pathway that the church seriously wants to take on, it's not going to do it with white leadership. So kind of thinking about what that looks like. And then to kind of make it personal, the other thing I would say here is, one more for churches, budgets. I would say that one of the things to think about in terms of repair, restitution, repairing the damage, every white Christian church really needs to think about putting a line item in their budget that is dedicated to something supporting either a fellow African-American church in the city or some cause that church says is important. Right? They relinquishes control of money and gives it to black-led organizations in the city. Sort of no strings attached, right? And I think and that also I think goes to our charitable giving. We think about our charitable giving as white Christians. I think certainly I grew up, most of our charitable giving was given right back to the church. Like that's how I grew up, right? The tithing was not, it wasn't NPR and all that. It was like give money, you tithe back to your church. But how can we do that a little differently? How can we think about being very deliberate and intentional of putting our money where our mouth is, or as the New Testament says, our treasure where our heart is on that. So I think I'll stop there. I'll do one last little thing here, and then I'll kind of slip. I'd love to hear kind of what's coming to mind. But one last admonition that I would give, kind of coming out of watching a lot of churches deal with this, is for I think it would be a great thing if white Christians would stop talking about reconciliation. This is the banner under which most white work in this historically has happened, where it has happened. Like Southern Baptist Convention has a racial reconciliation, motif going. But here's why. I think that what that frame of reconciliation does, as laudable as it is in the abstract, what it does is it ends up basically saying, look, we know that at the end of the day, we're all going to put our arms around each other and it's all going to be okay. Right? And it sort of puts pressure on African Americans in the partnership to get to that point, right? To say it's all okay, we're good. I kind of got this out of this kind of learning out of the First Baptist Church in Macon, where Scott Dickens just said, like, I've stopped talking about reconciliation. And what we've decided to do is to try to talk about repentance and repair. Like, that's what we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about justice. I think the beauty of that is that even if we think the mountaintop way over there is reconciliation, there's no getting there without walking through the valley of justice and repair. And here's, I think, also the beauty of it is that I think our African American brothers and sisters are going to tell us when we're good if we've done enough justice and repair. Right? That part is going to take care of itself. And so I think dedicating ourselves to this work of truth-telling, I think, is kind of entering the stream, is about telling the truth. And then loving our neighbors is really about this work of repentance and repair. And again, like I said last night, I think the good news is that this is not just something that's going to be good for relationships between us, we white Christians, and our African-American brothers and sisters, but it's actually going to be the place where we can find wholeness in ourselves. So I'm going to stop there. We got about 12 minutes or so. But I'd love to hear, like, I don't know, what else is coming up for you? What stories? And I think stories are really powerful here. The telling, one person telling a story, I think gives permission for other people to tell a story and triggers memories, triggers things. I think that, so let me just invite, I don't know, if there's stories that have come up for you, things maybe you haven't thought about in a while. If anybody want to throw something out.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. So the question is, what do we do with people who say, that's all in the past, has nothing to do with me, that was our grandfathers and great-grandfathers, but it's not us. And I would say, well, first of all, the Bible talks about sin being visited 7 generations right down the line. So the Bible has plenty to say about structural racism, structural injustice. We wrestle not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers. I mean, this is a sociological, systemic way of the Bible has of talking about these things. But the other thing I would say is that it doesn't take discipleship seriously. So we can't have it both ways. We can't say that our churches are powerful institutions for forming people in Christian life that can carry down from generation to generation. And that's the reason why we bring up our children in the churches that we built. And we build our theology and our hymns and our liturgy in certain ways because the institution, right, is a carrier of knowledge and practice and ways of living in the world. We can't say that that's true. And so we're plenty happy. We sing Faith of Our Fathers, right? And those kinds of things. We're happy to claim their influence in that way. But we can't have that influence without having all of their influence living among us, right? I mean, it's just not honest, really. I think is the way to put it. And it's right to say we've inherited a great many good things, right, from this. It's right to say that, right? And what I would say is, like, those little glossy church history volumes that get stuck in the church library. I wouldn't say go burn them. What I would say, though, is that there's a volume 2 to be written. Right, that's a parallel story that tells a truer story that's a little less propaganda, a little more truth, and that kind of helps us along the path. But I think we want to say that discipleship is real, that churches are powerful institutions for forming individuals until it's not great, until it's not good, right? But churches have been powerful in forming us into love and all of those kind of things. They have also been, we have to say it out loud, they have also been institutions that have formed white Christians into white supremacy. Like they just have. And so I think saying both of those things helps us disentangle it. And so I say, if you really love your church, if you really love the theology, if you really love Jesus, Jesus ain't white, and we got to figure out, we really need to tell a truer story, both for the health, it's really for the health of our churches, right? For the health of our faith at the end of the day. So I think trying to see that, and at the end, just kind of recognizing that that's a defensive move, right? It's a defensive move from a place of deep discomfort, right? If I can just say it's out there, it's not in me, I'm good, right? But there's no part of the gospel that calls us to just be, I'm good, right? It's work out your salvation, right? That's what the Christian life is supposed to be about. I think too often white Christians, because we make it all about salvation and this individual relationship with God, it's like that, I don't know, you had this experience on the county fair where there's the pony ride at the county fair and you can pay $1 and get your tickets and stick your kid on it. But the ponies just go in circles, right? They're attached to this little metal bar, and they just go around and around and around, and they do that all day long, and they wear tread in the thing, and they step on their own excrement, and it's a pretty sad scene, really, if you take it all in, right? But I'd submit that that's what this kind of individualistic, hyper-individualistic view of, that all of Christianity is about individual salvation, and that is it, is our theological version of the ponies going around and around at the county fair, right? But that's not the gospel, and that's not the journey that we're called to be on. And all right, well, the last thing is thank you so much. I hope that this will continue. And kind of the stories are really powerful, I think, and so continue to tell the stories. I think in making them public, I think is really important. The last thing I'll say is that for the probably white group we have here, that I do think that right now we have an opportunity that we have not had in a generation to do something different. There's a movement of the Spirit happening in the country. The Black Lives Matter movement has exploded to be an international movement. There's an opportunity, and the reason that there's resistance is because of this movement of the Spirit, right? And so I think I actually am taking the resistance against teaching critical race theory and the resistance to looking honestly at our history. You don't get resistance unless there's something to push against, right? And so I actually take that as something hopeful, right? That there is a movement that needs to be opposed, right, in many ways. And so I think let's put our shoulders to the wheel and let's push, because I really do think there's an opportunity to kind of move with the Spirit here. That like I said, I'm 53. I don't think I've seen anything like this and this opening and this opportunity in my lifetime. And I think the time is to be all in and push. So thank you this morning.
Thank you.